the guns fell silent on the morning of November 11th, 1918. After 4 long years of blood and horror, the Great War had ended, and across the Atlantic, a young and ambitious nation looked toward a new century with hope blazing in its eyes. The United States of America had emerged from the war stronger, richer, and prouder than ever before. While Europe lay in ruins, cities from New York to Chicago to San Francisco pulsed with energy. America had become the world's banker, the new center of industry, and the beating heart of innovation. To millions, it felt as though the American dream, that sacred promise of prosperity and freedom, was no longer a dream, but destiny itself. The 1920s began not with silence, but with music. Jazz filled the streets of Harlem, radios hummed in every home, and the automobile, that shining symbol of modern freedom, rolled off assembly lines faster than ever before. Henry Ford's Model T became more than a machine. It was a revolution on wheels, putting mobility within reach of ordinary families. In 1920, only a small portion of Americans owned cars. By 1929, there were over 23 million automobiles across the country, one for every 5 people. Factories expanded, skyscrapers pierced the sky, and electricity illuminated homes and cities. Washing machines, refrigerators, and telephones, once luxuries, were becoming common household items. The economy boomed, stock prices soared, optimism turned into certainty. America had never seen such wealth or believed so deeply in its own invincibility. But beneath the glittering surface, a dangerous illusion was taking shape. People believed the prosperity would last forever. Newspapers and financial advisors insisted that the stock market could only rise, that the future would be richer, brighter, endless. Banks offered easy loans. Ordinary citizens borrowed money to buy stocks, houses, and cars. Factories produced more goods than the people could actually buy. Farmers, who had once fed the world during the war, now faced plummeting prices as global demand fell. In the Midwest, vast fields of wheat and corn rotted, unsold, but few paid attention. Everyone was too busy chasing the dream. Credit was cheap, debt was invisible, and behind the euphoria, cracks in the foundation began to widen. The 1920s were also a time of transformation, not just economic, but social and cultural. Women, having earned the right to vote in 1920, stepped into public life like never before. The flapper became an icon of liberation, confident, daring, independent. Cities like New York became the epicenter of art and modern thought. Harlem gave rise to a cultural revolution, the Harlem Renaissance, where poets like Langston Hughes and musicians like Louis Armstrong reshaped the sound and soul of. But for all the glitter and glamour of urban life, the countryside told a different story. In rural America, small towns faced decline. Mechanization replaced labor, crop prices crashed, and thousands of families began to struggle. The divide between rich and poor, city and countryside, widened with each passing year. Still, America danced. Jazz played louder, money flowed faster, the party went on, and no one wanted to leave. Not everyone was blind to the danger. A few economists, journalists, and cautious investors began to sound alarms. They warned that the stock market's rise was unsustainable, that companies were overvalued, and the economy was being built on speculation rather than real growth. But in a nation intoxicated by success, such voices were drowned out. In 1928, President Calvin Coolidge declared, "The business of America is business." And the business was booming. By the summer of 1929, stock prices had reached record highs. Ordinary people, factory workers, teachers, farmers, invested their savings, believing wealth was just one lucky trade away. Banks encouraged it. Brokers offered easy margin loans, allowing people to buy $10 of stock for every dollar they owned. It was the perfect system until the first tremor hit. Late summer 1929, New York, shimmered in the golden glow of prosperity. Wall Street buzzed like a beehive. Everyone wanted to be rich, and for a moment, it seemed everyone already was. But in September, small cracks appeared. Steel production slowed. Car sales dipped. A few investors quietly began to sell their shares. Still, no one imagined what was coming. In the final days of October, as the leaves of Central Park turned red and gold, the illusion of endless wealth was about to collapse. Not slowly, but all at once. The American dream was about to face its darkest hour. The year was 1929. America stood at the very height of its prosperity. Cities glowed with electric light, factories roared with production, and the stock market had become the new temple of the American dream. From Wall Street to small towns across the country, people were buying stocks. It no longer mattered whether they understood the market, because everyone believed it was a sure path to wealth. The idea was simple: buy today, sell tomorrow, and watch your money multiply. For many, the stock exchange was not just a marketplace, it was a miracle machine. But beneath the soaring numbers, a dangerous illusion was tightening its grip. In the first half of 1929, the stock market was unstoppable. Share prices climbed almost every week, breaking record after record. Factories, railroads, automobile companies, even small startups saw their stock values explode. Newspapers printed headlines of overnight millionaires. Radio programs buzzed with market gossip. It was a national obsession. Barbers, teachers, farmers, housewives all poured their savings into stocks. Some took out loans, betting everything on continued growth. Banks, eager for profit, made credit easier than ever. Margin loans became the craze of the decade. With only $1 in hand, an investor could buy $10 worth of stock. But few realized what that meant. The market was no longer built on wealth. It was built on borrowed money. The higher the prices climbed, the thinner the line between fortune and ruin became. By early autumn, the signs were there for anyone willing to look. Industrial output had started to slow. Farmers faced another terrible harvest season. Wages were flat, and unemployment quietly crept upward. Still, most Americans refused to believe the good times could end. In September 1929, the first shock hit. The stock of a major company, United States Steel, began to fall sharply. A few cautious investors decided to sell, then a few more followed. But the majority held firm, trusting that the dip was temporary. The market steadied for a short while. Brokers reassured clients that everything was under control. But the confidence that had built the empire of prosperity was starting to crack. Then came Thursday, October 24th, 1929. It began like any other day. But when the opening bell rang on Wall Street, chaos erupted. Millions of shares flooded the market for sale. Panic rippled through the trading floor. Prices plunged faster than anyone could comprehend. Within hours, fortunes evaporated. Investors shouted, telephones rang endlessly, and messengers ran between offices, carrying orders that changed lives in seconds. By noon, the panic had spread across the nation. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange, desperate for news. Some wept, some stared in disbelief. Others insisted it was only a temporary fall, a small correction. As the day went on, a group of powerful bankers gathered in a desperate attempt to restore confidence. They pooled millions of dollars to buy blue-chip stocks, and for a moment, it worked. Prices steadied. The market closed that evening, bruised but not broken. The next day, newspapers announced that the panic was over. Investors breathed again. But the calm was only temporary. Monday, October 28th, the selling began again, heavier than before. Prices fell sharply. Margin calls swept through the system, forcing investors to sell their shares to cover debts. The next morning, Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the storm returned in full fury. It was the day that would be remembered forever as Black Tuesday. Over 16 million shares were traded in a single day, a record that stood for decades. Entire companies were wiped out. The ticker tape lagged hours behind, unable to keep up with the flood of transactions. People crowded outside brokerage offices, watching helplessly as their savings vanished. Banks began to fail under the strain. Small investors, who had once dreamed of riches, were now left with nothing. When the closing bell rang that afternoon, the stock market had lost nearly 1/3 of its value in just a few days. The Roaring Twenties had ended with a scream. The days that followed were filled with confusion, fear, and disbelief. The newspapers tried to calm the public, insisting that recovery was near. President Herbert Hoover assured Americans that the fundamentals of the economy were sound, but deep down, people knew something had changed forever. The stock market continued to tumble through November and December. What had begun as a correction turned into a full collapse. Billions of dollars in wealth disappeared. Businesses failed. Workers were laid off by the millions. For many families, life changed overnight. Savings accounts were emptied, homes were lost, and lines for food began to form in cities that had once glowed with prosperity. Banks that had once loaned freely now closed their doors. The dream of endless growth had turned into a nightmare of despair. By the end of 1929, America was no longer a nation celebrating success. It was a nation in shock. The party was over, and the lights had gone out. Factories that once ran day and night now stood silent. The sound of jazz faded into the background, replaced by the silence of unemployment and hunger. The rich had lost millions, but it was the ordinary people who suffered most. Their faith in the system was broken, their future uncertain. The Great Depression had begun, though few could yet grasp how deep or how long the darkness would last. For the first time in a generation, the American dream itself seemed to have collapsed. The year 1930 began in silence. The celebrations of the past were gone, the music had stopped, and the laughter of the Roaring Twenties was replaced by the quiet hum of uncertainty. At first, many Americans still believed the crash was only temporary. President Herbert Hoover and business leaders reassured the public that recovery was just around the corner. The newspapers echoed the same hope. But as winter turned to spring, the truth became impossible to ignore. Factories slowed, then stopped. Millions lost their jobs. What had started as a financial crisis on Wall Street was spreading into every home, every town, and every family across the nation. The Great Depression had begun its long and merciless descent. In the early months of 1930, there was still faith in the American spirit. People believed that hard work and optimism would bring the nation back. Businessmen urged calm, saying that the economy would correct itself. But the numbers told another story. By the summer of 1930, industrial production had fallen by nearly half. Automobile sales collapsed. Construction projects were abandoned midway. Unemployment soared past 4 million, then 6, then 8. For many families, savings were gone, swallowed by the stock market crash. With no income and no safety net, they turned to relatives, neighbors, and charity. Lines began to form outside churches and soup kitchens. In big cities like Chicago and New York, long rows of men stood quietly in the cold, waiting for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. Pride faded into hunger. In the countryside, another tragedy unfolded. Farmers who had thrived during the war years now faced ruin. With prices for crops collapsing, wheat and corn sold for less than the cost to grow them. A bushel of wheat that once sold for $1 now fetched only 10 or 15 cents. Livestock markets were no better. Farmers could not afford to feed their animals. Some slaughtered them rather than watch them starve. Banks began to foreclose on farms that had been in families for generations. Land that had once symbolized freedom and independence was now taken by creditors. Desperate farmers gathered in protests. In Iowa and Kansas, they blocked roads to stop foreclosures and demanded fair prices. But the government's response was slow and uncertain. Hoover insisted that the economy would heal itself. But for those who had lost everything, that promise rang hollow. The heart of the nation's financial system began to fail. Throughout 1930 and 1931, bank after bank closed its doors. Without insurance, depositors lost everything the moment a bank failed. In small towns, rumors spread like wildfire. People rushed to withdraw their savings before it was too late, causing panics that made collapse inevitable. By the end of 1931, more than 2,000 banks had failed, wiping out billions of dollars in deposits. The ripple effect was devastating. Businesses could no longer borrow. Farmers had no credit. Workers were laid off in greater numbers. Money, once the lifeblood of the economy, had simply stopped moving. By 1931, the Great Depression was no longer just a crisis of numbers. It was a human catastrophe. In cities, families crowded into small apartments, unable to pay rent. Evictions became a common sight. Homeless men built makeshift shelters on empty lots using cardboard, scrap wood, and tin. These shantytowns were mockingly called Hoovervilles, named after the president whom many blamed for their misery. Children went hungry. Malnutrition spread. Schools closed as local governments ran out of funds. For many Americans, survival became the only goal. The promise of the American dream had vanished, replaced by the harsh reality of despair. Yet even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness endured. Neighbors shared food. Communities organized soup kitchens and clothing drives. In those gestures, a quiet resilience began to take root. President Hoover, once celebrated as a hero of progress, now faced growing anger from every corner of the nation. He believed in limited government, that private charity and local communities should lead recovery. He feared that direct federal aid would destroy the American spirit of self-reliance. But by 1932, those ideas were no longer enough. Unemployment had reached nearly 25%. Thousands of businesses had closed. Industrial cities resembled ghost towns. Public frustration turned to fury. Protest marches filled the streets. In Washington, a group of World War I veterans known as the Bonus Army arrived, demanding early payment of their promised bonuses. They set up camps near the Capitol, pleading for help. Hoover refused, and when the veterans refused to leave, the government sent the army to drive them out. Tear gas filled the air. Tents were burned. The images shocked the nation. For many, it became a symbol of a government that had turned its back on its own people. By the end of 1932, America was on its knees. Factories lay silent, farms abandoned, banks closed, and millions homeless. Hunger haunted both the countryside and the cities. Confidence in the system was shattered. The same people who had once cheered the unstoppable progress of the 20s now faced the ruins of that dream. The coming winter was the hardest yet. Families burned furniture to stay warm. Soup lines stretched for blocks. Men wandered from town to town, searching for any kind of work. Yet in that darkness, a glimmer of hope began to stir. Across the country, people spoke of change. A new election loomed, and a new leader promised a different vision, one that could restore faith and rebuild a broken nation. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By 1933, the United States had reached its breaking point. Factories were closed, the stock market lay in ruins, and banks were collapsing one after another. Hunger haunted families who once lived in comfort, and the very idea of the American dream seemed dead. Then came a new voice, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His confident tone, his calm demeanor, and his promise to deliver a new deal for the American people sparked a flicker of hope in a nation paralyzed by fear. When he took the oath of office in March 1933, Roosevelt declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It was more than rhetoric. It was a call to arms for a wounded people. The first 100 days of FDR's presidency would become legendary. In less than 4 months, he pushed through a whirlwind of legislation designed to stabilize the economy and restore faith in the system. The Emergency Banking Act reopened sound banks and shut down failing ones. When Roosevelt addressed the nation in his first fireside chat, his words reached millions of anxious Americans huddled around their radios. His voice was calm, reassuring, and human. Within days, confidence began to return. People brought their money back to the banks. The immediate panic eased. Then came the alphabet agencies, the CCC, the WPA, the NRA, and the TVA, bold experiments in social and economic reform. Each was an attempt to rebuild a shattered nation piece by piece. The Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men jobs planting trees, building parks, and restoring the environment. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave purpose to those who had lost everything. In the forests and fields of America, thousands of men found meaning again. The Works Progress Administration put millions to work constructing roads, schools, bridges, and public buildings. Artists and writers were also employed, creating murals, guidebooks, and stories that captured the soul of the era. It wasn't just economic recovery, it was cultural revival. The National Recovery Administration sought to reform industry by setting fair wages and prices, though it faced resistance and eventual downfall. Still, it represented an effort to balance the interests of workers and business owners at a time when both were desperate. And in the South, the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed one of the poorest regions in the country. By building dams, providing electricity, and controlling floods, the TVA symbolized the power of government to reshape not only the economy, but also the landscape itself. Not everyone believed in Roosevelt's vision. Critics called the New Deal socialism, a dangerous expansion of federal power. Business leaders warned that it stifled free enterprise. On the other side, populists like Huey Long argued that it didn't go far enough. Every man a king, he declared, demanding wealth redistribution and social justice. Still, Roosevelt pressed on. His programs didn't end the Depression, but they changed the relationship between the American people and their government forever. For the first time, Washington became a guardian of welfare and stability, not merely an observer of the market. By 1935, with unemployment still high, Roosevelt launched the Second New Deal, a new wave of reforms aimed at long-term security. The Social Security Act introduced unemployment insurance and pensions for the elderly, a safety net that endures to this day. The Wagner Act empowered labor unions, giving workers a collective voice they had long been denied. For the working class, these measures were a lifeline. For the wealthy elite, they were a threat. The nation was divided not by geography, but by ideology, between those who saw Roosevelt as a savior and those who saw him as a destroyer of capitalism. As the 1930s wore on, the New Deal began to show results. Confidence grew. The banking system stabilized. Millions of Americans went back to work. The dust storms still raged, and poverty persisted. But there was progress, slow, steady, and undeniable. Through it all, Roosevelt's voice remained a beacon of reassurance. His fireside chats gave Americans something to hold on to, a sense of connection, of being seen and heard. He had become more than a president. He was a symbol of endurance and resilience. As the decade drew to a close, a new storm was brewing beyond America's shores. Across Europe, the shadow of fascism spread. Hitler rearmed Germany. Mussolini expanded his empire. And the world teetered on the edge of another catastrophic conflict. The United States, though still recovering, began to stir. The gears of its factories turned again, producing weapons and supplies for nations already at war. The economy, long dormant, started to awaken, not through domestic policy, but through global necessity. By 1939, as the first bombs fell on Poland and the world descended into war once more, America stood at a crossroads. The Great Depression had scarred it deeply, but had also transformed it profoundly. The faith in unregulated capitalism was gone. The belief in collective action, in the power of unity, had taken root. A nation that had entered the decade broken and divided was emerging stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. It had learned that dreams could shatter, but they could also be rebuilt. The American dream had not died in the Great Depression. It had been reborn. As the 1930s came to an end, the world was once again descending into chaos. In Europe, Adolf Hitler's armies marched across borders unchecked. Nazi Germany had consumed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and now its sights were set on Poland. In Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions spread across China and the Pacific. The global order was collapsing, and with it came a storm that would soon reach American shores. The United States, still recovering from the wounds of the Great Depression, watched from across the ocean. The scars of World War I were still fresh. The nation's spirit was weary, and its people were wary of foreign entanglements. Isolationism became the shield of a country determined to avoid another catastrophe. But though America stood apart, it could not stand idle. Its factories began to stir once again. Weapons, planes, and ships rolled off assembly lines as part of Roosevelt's effort to support the Allies through the Lend-Lease program. What had started as a cautious policy of assistance soon became the engine of economic rebirth. The war economy, before America even entered the conflict, began to pull the nation out of its decade-long slump. Industrial towns that had been silent now roared with activity. Unemployment, which had haunted the country since 1929, began to vanish. The Great Depression, after 10 years of suffering, was finally ending, not through legislation or reform, but through the demands of global war. In December 1940, President Roosevelt gave a speech that would define America's new role in the world. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared. It was not just a slogan, it was a mission. Factories that once built cars were now building tanks. Assembly lines that once produced consumer goods were converted into war machines. Men and women, young and old, poured into the workforce. For the first time in American history, women entered factories in massive numbers, becoming a vital part of the nation's industrial might. The image of Rosie the Riveter would come to symbolize a new kind of strength and unity. The economic revival was staggering. The same government that had struggled to create jobs during the New Deal now found itself scrambling to meet labor shortages. Private industry, long skeptical of Roosevelt's policies, now worked hand in hand with Washington to fuel the war effort. The cooperation was imperfect, but it was effective. The Depression's despair was being replaced by determination. For millions of Americans, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The jobs returned, the wages rose, and the factories once again became the beating heart of the nation. Then came December 7th, 1941, the day that would live in infamy. When Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into the Second World War. In that single moment, the long isolation of the 1930s ended. America, once a spectator, became a participant. The factories that had been preparing for war went into full production. Every resource, every hand, every ounce of strength was mobilized. But more than that, something deeper shifted. The fear and hopelessness that had defined the Depression years were gone. The American people, hardened by a decade of struggle, stood ready to fight. The Great Depression had tested them, broken them, and rebuilt them into something stronger. Now, that strength would be tested on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. As the war raged on, America underwent a transformation unlike anything in its history. Between 1941 and 1945, the nation's industrial output tripled. The Depression-era unemployment rate, once 25%, dropped to almost zero. Millions of soldiers went abroad, while millions more at home fueled the war effort. The Depression had been an age of scarcity. The war became an age of production. By the end of the conflict, the United States stood unrecognizable from the country that had collapsed in 1929. It was now the most powerful industrial and military force on the planet. Its economy had not only recovered, but expanded beyond imagination. The Great Depression had forced America to reinvent itself. It had shifted from an agrarian, consumer-driven society to an industrial and global one. The hardships of the 1930s had taught lessons in resilience, innovation, and the importance of unity in times of crisis. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world looked to the United States not as a debtor nation or a broken dream, but as a leader, a beacon of recovery and strength. The Great Depression did not end in a single moment, nor did its lessons fade quickly. Its memory lingered in the minds of those who had lived through it. The farmers who lost their land, the families who queued in bread lines, the workers who built the New Deal projects, and the soldiers who carried those memories into war. They all became part of a shared national identity. The Depression had changed the way Americans saw their government, their economy, and themselves. It had created a social contract built on the belief that the government bore some responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. Programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor rights were no longer radical ideas. They were permanent fixtures of the American landscape. The crisis had also instilled a deep caution in economic policy. The specter of 1929 haunted generations of leaders who would strive to prevent another collapse. Fiscal reform, financial regulation, and the Federal Reserve's new powers all stemmed from the lessons learned in those dark years. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Great Depression was psychological. It forged a generation of Americans who understood both hardship and hope, loss and resilience. They had seen the collapse of the American dream, but they had also witnessed its rebirth. Out of desperation had come determination. Out of suffering, solidarity. Out of ruin, renewal. The Great Depression began as a story of failure, but it ended as a story of endurance. It reminded the world that even in its darkest hours, America's greatest strength lay not in its wealth or its power, but in its people. And though the Depression had broken the illusion of endless prosperity, it had also built the foundation for a new kind of dream, one defined not by greed or speculation, but by unity, perseverance, and purpose. From the ashes of the market crash rose a stronger nation, one that had rediscovered itself. The Great Depression was not just the collapse of the American dream, it was its transformation.